Snow fell mercilessly, covering the empty road like a thick, relentless blanket. The biting wind howled through the bare trees, making the branches creak under the weight of the ice. In the middle of this freezing landscape, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow-covered road. Inside the car, Mateo Rivera gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep control of the vehicle on the slippery road. He was returning from a long work trip and wanted nothing more than to get home, drink a hot cup of coffee, and curl up under a warm blanket. But something in the distance made his heart pound. At first, it looked like just a lone tree by the side of the road. But as the headlights illuminated the area more clearly, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A large German shepherd was tied to a tree, covered in snow, violently trembling. Its body was stiff, and its eyes held a mix of fear and resignation. Mateo slammed on the brakes, causing the car to skid a few feet before coming to a stop. The engine hummed softly, but all he could hear was the wind howling outside. Without hesitation, he opened the door, immediately hit by the icy air like razor-sharp blades against his skin. He ran toward the dog, his heart pounding in his chest. The animal didn't even flinch. Its fur was coated in ice, and its breathing was weak, coming out in small white puffs in the freezing air. Mateo knelt beside it and touched its body. It was so cold it felt like stone. "Oh my God, who could do this to you?" he whispered, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. The thick rope around the dog's neck was tightly secured to the tree trunk. Someone had left him there to die. Mateo felt a lump form in his throat. If he hadn't passed by, the dog likely wouldn't survive a few more hours in this brutal cold. His fingers, already numb from the freezing air, struggled to untie the tight knot. The dog let out a weak whimper, as if it had already given up. But Mateo wouldn't give up. After a few tense moments, he finally managed to loosen the rope. The moment it was free, the dog collapsed onto the snow, too weak to stand. Mateo looked around, trying to find any sign of who had done this. But there was nothing. No fresh footprints. No tracks leading away. Just the vast, silent snow and the deep sorrow in the dog's eyes. He couldn't leave him there, but taking him with him also meant facing a huge challenge. The dog was alive, but for how much longer? Without a second thought, Mateo made a decision that would change not only the dog's life but also his own. "Come on, buddy. I'm not leaving you here." He lifted the dog into his arms and rushed back to the car. What he didn't know was that this night was only the beginning of a story he would never forget. And so, without knowing his name or his past, Mateo decided to save Bob. If the story touched you, leave a like. It helps us bring more amazing stories. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. What awaits Bob and Mateo? Stay tuned. Mateo laid Bob gently on the back seat of his car, his hands trembling. Not just from the cold, but from the fury and desperation that burned inside him. The dog barely moved, his body limp, his breathing weak and uneven. The dim glow from the dashboard lights revealed how severe his condition was. Ice clung to his fur, his paws were cracked and raw, and his ribs faintly showed beneath his thick coat. "Hold on, buddy. Just a little longer," Mateo muttered as he turned the car's heater up to full blast, hoping the warmth would bring some life back into the dog's frozen body. But time was slipping away. With one hand gripping the wheel, he frantically searched his phone for the nearest emergency vet. It was past midnight, and the small towns along this highway weren't exactly filled with 24-hour services. His pulse quickened as he realized the closest open clinic was nearly 30 minutes away. A faint whimper from the back seat made his stomach drop. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he saw Bob's eyes, half-closed, distant, fading. The dog was slipping away. "No, no, no. Stay with me, Bob. You gotta fight. Okay?" Mateo's voice cracked, and without a second thought, he pressed harder on the gas pedal. The road stretched endlessly ahead, covered in thick snow, the dark silhouettes of trees lining both sides. His heart pounded as he struggled to keep control of the car. The only sounds inside were the low hum of the heater and Bob's labored breathing. Then, Through the swirling snow, a faint glow appeared in the distance. A gas station. Mateo swerved into the parking lot and threw the car into park, jumping out before the engine had fully stopped. Inside, an older man stood behind the counter, sipping coffee and watching a small TV. The station was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. Mateo shoved the door open. "Hey, do you know where the nearest emergency vet is?" His voice was urgent, breathless. The man blinked, startled. "Vet? There's one in Greenville, about 30 minutes south. But I doubt they're open this late. Do you have their number?" The man scratched his head and reached under the counter, pulling out an old, grease-stained phone book. Too slow. Mateo's fingers twitched with frustration. Bob doesn't have 30 minutes. Then an idea struck him. He didn't need a clinic. He needed someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who could help right now. A name flashed in his mind. Someone he hadn't spoken to in a long time. Someone he never expected to call again. Calla. With shaking hands, he grabbed his phone and dialed a number he had nearly deleted more times than he could count. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, finally, a groggy voice answered. "Mateo? Do you have any idea what time it is?" Mateo exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. "Yeah, and I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't an emergency." A pause. Then, a tired sigh. "What's going on?" Mateo glanced back at Bob, wrapped in blankets, barely clinging to life. "I found a dog. He's in bad shape. I need your help, Calla. Please." Mateo's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he drove through the winding, snow-covered road. The conversation with Calla had been brief, but the weight of her voice still echoed in his head. She had agreed to help, but not without hesitation. He stole a glance at the back seat, where Bob lay bundled in blankets, barely moving. His breathing was shallow, his body still trembling despite the warmth of the heater. Every few minutes, Mateo spoke to him, as if his voice alone could keep the dog holding on. "Almost there, buddy. Just stay with me." The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick trees surrounding the road. As he neared his destination, old memories began creeping back. Memories he had tried to bury. He hadn't seen Calla in years, hadn't even thought about coming back here. And yet, here he was, seeking her out, as if fate had forced their paths to cross once again. When he finally pulled into the long driveway, his chest tightened. Nothing had changed. The cabin still stood as it always had, tucked between towering pines, smoke curling from the chimney, a warm glow spilling from the windows. It was exactly as he remembered, and yet it felt entirely different. Before he could even step out of the car, the front door opened. Calla stood in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy coat, her arms crossed against the cold. Her dark eyes studied him from a distance, unreadable. Mateo had expected anger, maybe even resentment, but all he saw in her face was something much worse: indifference. "Well," her voice cut through the silence. "Is he still alive?" Mateo didn't answer right away. He turned, opening the back door carefully, and lifted Bob into his arms. The dog barely stirred. He was getting worse. As he carried him toward the porch, Calla stepped back, holding the door open just enough for him to enter. The warmth inside hit him instantly, a sharp contrast to the brutal cold outside. The scent of burning firewood filled the air, mixed with something familiar: lavender. She still used the same candles. He laid Bob gently on the large rug near the fireplace, unwrapping the blankets. Calla knelt beside him, her expression shifting from guarded to focused. "How long has he been like this?" "I found him an hour ago. He was tied to a tree, covered in ice." Something flickered in Calla's eyes: shock, anger, sadness. Maybe all three. She placed a gentle hand on Bob's side, feeling for warmth. Then she touched his paws, frowning at the cracked pads. "His body temperature is dangerously low," she muttered. "We need to warm him up slowly, or he could go into shock." She got up quickly, moving toward a cabinet, pulling out supplies: towels, a first aid kit, a bottle of what looked like electrolyte solution. Mateo watched, knowing he should be helping, but unable to shake the feeling that he didn't belong here anymore. "I can do this alone, Mateo," she said without looking at him. "You don't have to stay." For a moment, he considered leaving. He had brought Bob to someone who knew how to help. His job was done. But when he looked down at the dog, his body weak, his breathing ragged, he knew he couldn't walk away. "Not this time. I'm staying," he said firmly. Calla finally met his eyes. There was a pause, a silent exchange of words neither of them dared to speak. Then, she simply nodded. Without another word, they got to work. The warmth of the cabin contrasted sharply with the freezing night outside, but Bob was still ice-cold. Mateo sat on the floor beside him, watching as Calla worked with practiced hands. She wrapped warm towels around the dog's frail body, her movements quick and precise, her focus unwavering. The fire crackled behind them, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Bob let out a weak whimper as Calla gently massaged his stiff paws, trying to restore circulation. His breathing was still labored, his eyes barely open, but there was a flicker of awareness in them, a quiet fight to hold on. Mateo's chest tightened. He had found Bob by chance, but now it felt like something more, something he couldn't walk away from. Calla reached for a syringe filled with a hydration solution and injected it just under Bob's skin. Mateo flinched slightly at the sight, but Calla didn't even blink. She had done this before. "This should help," she murmured, pressing her fingers gently against Bob's chest. "But he's not safe yet. His body temperature is still too low." Mateo exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His mind was racing, not just with worry for Bob, but with the weight of this moment. Being here, in this cabin with Calla, felt like stepping into a past he had tried to leave behind. He glanced at her, taking in the way she still carried herself with quiet strength, the same way she always had. "You still taking in strays?" he asked, attempting a small, tired smile. Calla met his gaze for a second before looking away. "Some things don't change," she said simply. Then, after a pause, she added, "But some things do." Mateo didn't ask what she meant. He didn't have to. Just then, Bob let out a small, strained sigh. His body twitched slightly, and for the first time since Mateo had found him, his tail gave the weakest of wags. Calla's eyes widened. "That's a good sign." Mateo swallowed hard, emotion swelling in his throat. He hadn't realized how much hope he had been holding in until that moment. Bob was still fighting, and for the first time in a long time, Mateo felt like he had something worth fighting for, too. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls of the cabin. Mateo sat on the floor beside Bob, his back against the couch, exhaustion pulling at his body. He hadn't realized how cold he still was until the warmth of the room began to seep into his skin. But Bob was colder. His breathing had steadied slightly, but his body remained fragile, his fur damp from melted ice. Mateo could still feel the sharp chill lingering in the dog's frail frame. Calla worked in silence, her expression unreadable as she gently checked Bob's pulse again. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, her touch careful but firm. Mateo had almost forgotten how precise she was, how she always seemed to know what to do in moments of crisis. He watched as she reached for a bowl of water, dipping a cloth inside before carefully pressing it against Bob's dry, cracked nose. "He's dehydrated," she murmured, mostly to herself. "I'll try to get him to drink in a bit, but for now we need to keep his body temperature from dropping again." Mateo nodded, though he wasn't sure if she even expected an answer. The silence between them was heavier than the storm outside. There were 1,000 things he could say, apologies, explanations, questions, but none of them seemed right. Not now. Maybe not ever. Calla finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time since he had walked through that door. "If he makes it through the night, he has a real chance," she said, her voice quieter now, more measured. "But you should know. It's not just about tonight. If he survives, he'll need weeks of care, maybe longer." Mateo swallowed hard. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He had found Bob in the snow, barely alive, and his only focus had been saving him. But what happened next? Could he just drop Bob off somewhere and walk away? Could he even let go after everything they had been through in just a few hours? Calla seemed to sense the hesitation in his silence. She sighed and stood up, stretching her arms before crossing them over her chest. "You don't have to stay, Mateo," she said, the edge in her voice softer now. "I can take care of him." Mateo let out a slow breath, rubbing his hands together as if trying to shake off the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Leaving would be easy. It would be logical. But as he looked down at Bob, his frail body curled up near the fire, his chest rising and falling with effort, Mateo knew the truth. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally, his voice firm. Calla studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a small nod, as if accepting something unspoken. Neither of them said anything else. The past could wait. Tonight, their only fight was for Bob's survival. What would you do if you were in Mateo's shoes? Do you think he's ready to take on this responsibility? Or should he leave Bob in Calla's care? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The hours stretched endlessly, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on Mateo like a heavy stone. The only sounds in the cabin were the rhythmic crackling of the fire and the faint, labored breathing of Bob. Mateo hadn't moved from his spot on the floor, his back against the couch, his gaze locked on the fragile dog wrapped in blankets. Every shallow rise and fall of Bob's chest felt like a countdown, a battle between life and death. Across from him, Calla sat with her legs folded beneath her, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. The warm light from the fireplace flickered against her face, casting shadows beneath her tired eyes. She looked different now, older, maybe stronger. But the way she focused on Bob, the quiet determination in her expression, reminded Mateo of the woman he once knew. She had always been like this, silent but relentless when it came to saving lives. A soft whimper broke the silence. Bob's body shuddered beneath the blankets, his paws twitching slightly. Mateo immediately leaned forward, his heart slamming against his ribs. Was this a sign of recovery, or was he slipping away? His pulse pounded in his ears as he looked at Calla, searching her face for any indication of what was happening. Calla placed her mug on the wooden floor and reached out, pressing gentle fingers against Bob's ribs. She was quiet for a moment, listening, feeling. Then she exhaled, a subtle tension easing from her shoulders. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice softer than he remembered. "His body is adjusting. He's reacting to the warmth. That's a good sign." Mateo let out a slow breath, rubbing his hands over his face. He hadn't realized how tense he was until that moment. The fear of losing Bob had latched onto him, digging deep, refusing to let go. He had found the dog by chance, but somehow, in just a few short hours, it felt like more than that. Like fate had put them on the same path for a reason. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling slightly. His exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was something heavier, something that had been pressing down on him for years. "I don't get it," he said finally, his voice rough with frustration. "How can people do this? Just leave them out there, knowing they'll die?" Calla didn't answer right away. She simply watched him, studying him the way she used to, as if she could still read the things he wasn't saying. Then she took a slow sip of coffee, exhaling before she finally spoke. "Because not everyone sees them the way we do," she said simply. "Not everyone cares." Her words hit harder than Mateo expected. He clenched his jaw, the anger bubbling beneath his exhaustion. How could anyone be that cruel? How could someone tie a dog to a tree in the middle of a storm and walk away, knowing he wouldn't survive? He looked down at Bob, his frail body barely clinging to life, and something inside him twisted painfully. "Well, I care," he said quietly, almost to himself. Calla gave a small nod, as if she had already known that. She pulled a thick blanket from the couch and draped it over Bob's body, tucking it in gently. Mateo stayed where he was, watching Bob's slow breathing, feeling every moment stretch out longer than the last. Against all odds, Bob was still fighting. And for the first time in a long time, Mateo realized he was fighting for something, too. The night stretched on, the storm outside having quieted to nothing more than a gentle snowfall. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire was the only real comfort, but even that felt fragile, like it could fade at any moment, just like Bob's life hanging by a thread. Mateo sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, exhaustion pressing down on him, but he refused to close his eyes. Across from him, Calla was just as still, watching Bob with quiet intensity. The dog hadn't moved much, but his breathing had steadied slightly. His body, once ice-cold, was now warm beneath the layers of blankets. It wasn't enough to declare victory, but it was a sign that the fight wasn't over. Mateo leaned his elbows on his knees, rubbing his face with both hands before letting out a slow exhale. He didn't know how long they had been sitting there, minutes, hours, a lifetime. It felt like time had blurred the moment he had stepped into this cabin, as if the past and present had collided, trapping him in a reality he hadn't prepared for. "You're still the same," Calla said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, thoughtful. Mateo lifted his gaze to her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head slightly, as if debating whether to say more. Then she shrugged. "Always carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Mateo let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah, well, some things don't change." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over Bob's still body. Mateo's gaze drifted back to the dog, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. "I'm not the same, though," Calla said, her voice softer this time. Mateo looked at her again, something unreadable in her expression. He thought about the time they had spent apart, the years that had passed without a single word between them. She had changed. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way she no longer looked at him with the same fire she once had. But before he could say anything, Bob let out a weak, breathy sigh, the faintest sound, but enough to make both of them freeze. Mateo immediately leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Bob!" The dog's ear twitched ever so slightly. Then, with great effort, he opened his eyes. Calla sucked in a sharp breath. Mateo felt something in his chest tighten, hope surging through him like a fire reigniting after nearly burning out. Bob was still here, still fighting, and for the first time since Mateo had found him, he knew Bob wasn't going to give up. Bob's eyes were barely open, two tired amber slivers reflecting the dim glow of the fire. His body remained still, too weak to move, but he was awake, and that was everything. Mateo felt a rush of relief so strong it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, leaning in closer. Bob's gaze shifted ever so slightly, just enough to let Mateo know he was aware of his presence. Beside him, Calla let out a slow, measured breath. Mateo could see the tension in her shoulders ease, but she didn't celebrate. Not yet. She had seen too much, lost too many to believe that one small improvement meant they were safe. "His body is still weak," she said carefully. "We need to take it slow. No sudden movements, no stress." Mateo nodded, understanding. But despite her cautious words, he could see it, the quiet hope in her eyes. She wasn't ready to admit it, but she wanted Bob to make it just as much as he did. Bob let out a small, shaky exhale, his nose twitching as he took in his surroundings. Mateo reached out carefully, brushing his fingers against the dog's fur. It was still damp, but at least it was warm now. Bob didn't flinch at his touch. Instead, he let out a weak but unmistakable sigh of trust. The simple gesture hit Mateo harder than he expected. He swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat, forcing himself to take a steady breath. How had this dog, this nearly lifeless creature he had found in the snow, managed to burrow so deep into his heart in just a few hours? He glanced at Calla, wondering if she was thinking the same thing. But before he could say anything, Bob's eyes drifted shut again. Not from distress, but from exhaustion. For the first time since Mateo had found him, he was sleeping peacefully. Mateo sat back against the couch, exhaling slowly. The worst wasn't over, but for the first time that night, he believed that Bob might actually survive. Morning crept into the cabin slowly, the pale winter sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, frozen landscape outside. Inside, the air was still warm from the fire, the scent of burnt wood and coffee lingering in the space. But Mateo barely noticed any of it. His attention was fixed on Bob. The dog was still curled up on the blankets, his breathing slow but steady. He had made it through the night. He was alive. The weight of that realization settled deep in Mateo's chest, filling a space he hadn't realized was empty. Calla sat across from him, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee, her eyes scanning Bob's form with quiet focus. She hadn't said much since they had woken up, but she didn't need to. Mateo could tell she was thinking the same thing he was. They had done everything they could. Now it was up to Bob. Mateo shifted slightly, stretching out his sore muscles from spending the night on the floor. He should leave. Now that Bob was stable, Calla didn't need him here anymore. But as he thought about walking out that door, a strange feeling settled in his stomach. He had been so focused on saving Bob that he hadn't considered what would come next. What happens now? He asked finally, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Calla glanced at him, her fingers tightening around her mug. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something else. But then, she simply said, "He'll need time, rest, food, patience." Mateo nodded, but her answer didn't feel complete. What he really meant was, what happens to us? To this? Before he could ask, Bob stirred slightly, his tail giving the faintest of wags. It was weak, barely noticeable, but it was there. A sign of life, a sign of trust. Mateo reached out instinctively, running his fingers gently over Bob's fur. The dog let out a soft sigh but didn't pull away. He was still here, still fighting. And for the first time in a long time, so was Mateo. Days passed, and little by little, Bob grew stronger. His steps were unsteady at first, his body still weak from the trauma, but each day brought a new sign of progress. First, he lifted his head without struggle. Then, he managed to stand, wobbling but determined. And finally, on a crisp morning, he took his first real steps outside, his paws sinking lightly into the snow. Mateo watched him closely, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, hope, maybe even purpose. He had never intended to keep Bob, never imagined himself responsible for anything more than passing through life one day at a time. But now, the idea of leaving him behind felt impossible. Beside him, Calla stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Mateo had stayed longer than he expected, longer than he had planned. At first, it was just to make sure Bob would survive. Then it became something more, a quiet, unspoken agreement between them. "You should take him," Calla said suddenly, breaking the silence. Mateo turned to her, surprised. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her gaze never leaving Bob as he sniffed the air, his tail wagging slightly. "He trusts you. He needs you." Mateo swallowed, glancing back at Bob. The truth was, he needed Bob too. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He wasn't lost. He had found something worth staying for. Kneeling down, he ran a hand gently over Bob's head. The dog leaned into his touch, letting out a small, contented sigh. "Come on, buddy," Mateo whispered. "Let's go home." As he stood, Calla met his eyes one last time. There were no promises, no guarantees, just a quiet understanding. Sometimes, second chances come in the most unexpected ways. And as Mateo walked away, Bob trotting beside him, he knew one thing for certain. Neither of them would ever be alone again. Did this story touch your heart? Leave a like. It helps us share more incredible stories. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss an emotional story. What would you have done if you found Bob? Tell us in the comments. Share this with an animal lover. Let's spread kindness together.